Hello everyone, welcome to our digestion and excretion lecture. The first half of this lecture will consist of an introduction to the digestive systems of animals and the dietary influences that help shape the evolution of digestion. The second half of this lecture will cover what we do with the leftovers once we're done digesting our food. What happens to all that indigestible material and how do we excrete it? Also, how does our body get rid of other waste products, like metabolic waste, for example? That'll be in part 2. All right, first, let's talk about what digestion is. We can define it as the breakdown of nutrient or energy-rich materials, which we just call food, into much smaller absorbable particles. Okay? You can have mechanical digestion, chemical digestion, or a combination of both. Mechanical digestion is what happens when you chew up your food or in some other way physically break it down. So that's mechanical digestion, when you physically crush or break the food into smaller and smaller pieces. Chemical digestion is when you use acids or enzymes to further render that food into smaller particles. Many digestive systems use a combination of these two factors. As an example, consider mammals. Many mammals chew their food, meaning when the food enters their mouth, they crush it between their teeth. And this crushing renders the food into smaller and smaller pieces. But there's actually chemical digestion happening in the mouth as well. Salivary amylase is a kind of enzyme that breaks complicated molecules, such as starches, down into simpler molecules, such as individual sugar molecules. So you have a combination of both mechanical and chemical digestion happening immediately after the food enters the body. Animals can perform something called intracellular digestion. Intra meaning inside, cellular meaning the cell. This is when food breakdown occurs inside of organelles called food vacuoles. Now we talked about this a bit earlier when we were studying the sister group to the animals, which were the protists, specifically the protozoans. We had several types of protozoans who used food vacuoles to break down their food. The paramecium was the most obvious example. But animals do this as well. Puriferans, our sponges, perform intracellular digestion in those amoebocytes that are connected to our choanocytes. Cnidarians perform it as well inside their gastrovascular cavity, the central cavity in the middle of the body. And also flatworms, our platyhelminthes. These guys perform intracellular digestion inside of their gastrovascular cavity as well. Remember, there's an exception to this rule for platyhelminthes. Remember, class Cestota does not perform intracellular digestion. In fact, they don't do digestion at all. Why? They're parasites. These are our tapeworms. Tapeworms absorb already digested material straight from their host. The host is doing the digesting, the tapeworms just have to sit back and absorb it. Okay? It's a pretty adaptive lifestyle. Now, what all these groups have in common is that actual digestion is not happening in this open space inside the gastrovascular cavity. There aren't any chemicals being injected into that open space to mix with the food. Instead, the individual cells, which I'm drawing extra large so they're easy to see, are picking up food particles that are inside the gastrovascular cavity. They're grabbing these food particles and pulling them inside the cell in order to break them down. So breakdown is happening inside the cells that line these gastrovascular cavities. It's not happening in the open space of the cavity itself. If it were, we'd call it extracellular digestion. Extra meaning outside, cell meaning cell. This is digestion happening outside the cell, and it's occurring when chemicals or mechanical crushers, for example, are used to break up food in an open space inside the body, usually within something we call a digestive tube. This open space is called the lumen, right? So if you have, say, a stomach, here's a very simple stomach, okay? The lumen would be this open area in the middle where the food would pass through. Okay? So food is broken down in that open space, and then the nutrients are what get pulled out into surrounding cells and usually dumped into the bloodstream so that the circulatory system can then pass those nutrients on to other parts of the body. You see this in a huge number of different animals. Annelids, arthropods, and chordates are just a few examples. Okay? Mollusks go in this group as well. We are going to focus on extracellular digestion because it's the most complex form of digestion that we see in animals. Extracellular digestion, as I said, occurs in a digestive tube, but that tube usually has lots of structures in it that do different jobs. The digestive tube, or more formally, the digestive tract, has 4 major functions. First is ingestion. You're bringing food into the body, so you're collecting it and then moving that food down into the digestive tract. Digestion is the actual mechanical or chemical breakdown of that food, and absorption is what happens to the nutrients that are released from the food. They're collected from the lumen and then dispersed to the parts of the body that need them. Anything that's left over after this process, anything that's what we call indigestible, we can't break it down or use it, is excreted. Excretion is the elimination of those leftover products, what we call waste, from the body. We are going to talk about each step in this process. Now, not all animals are going to digest food the same way. So one of the first things we need to discuss is all the different ways that digestive tracts have evolved in our various animal phyla. Animal digestive tracts can be broken down into one of 2 broad categories. There are what we call incomplete digestive tracts, and then there are complete digestive tracts. Incomplete digestive tracts have just a single opening in them. It counts as both the mouth and the anus. So an incomplete digestive tract would look something like this. There's a single hole connected to some sort of digestive organ. Food goes in through this hole, it's broken down, and then waste comes out of this hole. So that single hole is used for both ingestion and excretion. Cnidarians are built this way. Think about what a jellyfish looks like. You have the belly. You've got that oral opening. Food goes in to the bell, and then waste comes out. But there's only this one opening that allows that sort of passage. Ctenophores and platyhelminthes work the same way. One hole used as both the mouth and the anus. Complete digestive tracts have 2 holes. Okay? They have a separate hole for the mouth and the anus. And usually food travels one way. Okay? There's no movement back towards the mouth, unless you are dealing with some sort of food poisoning or digestive problem. Okay? Also, complete digestive tracts are usually separated from the outer body wall. Okay? If you are an animal that has a digestive tract connected to your body wall, such that every part of your digestive tube has to be anchored to your outer body wall, that means your digestive tube can only be as long as your total body length. You're limited. But meanwhile, what if you could disconnect the tube from the body wall and only leave two connection points, one at the mouth, one at the anus. Now, you can create a digestive tube that wraps around itself over and over, that waves in and out like this. It overlaps itself. Okay, like that. If we were to stretch out that yellow tube, it would probably be, I don't know, maybe about this long. But it would be substantially longer than the body wall. That's the take-home message. If your tube doesn't have to be connected to your body wall, you can grow a much, much longer tube that folds back on itself like this. The longer the tube, the more absorption of nutrients you can do. The more surface area there is, the more absorption you can achieve. That's the advantage of having a longer digestive tract. And you can get longer digestive tracts by having that tract be separate from the body wall. Now, these digestive tracts have a couple of different names that show up in literature. Sometimes they're just called digestive tracts, sometimes digestive tubes. But the one formal name you'll see most often is you'll see these digestive tubes called alimentary canals. That's the formal name for a digestive tract. And it's one I'm going to use from this point forward. These alimentary canals, digestive tracts, have three different regions. There's the foregut, which is at the front of the body. So if you look at this diagram of a rove beetle, see the foregut is up here. Then there's the midgut. The midgut is, as you'd expect, towards the center of the body. And then the hindgut, which comes at the end. Okay. Now, different things happen in each of these regions. The foregut is used for ingestion, using things like the mouth to bring food into the body. Temporary storage, structures such as crops are used to temporarily house food until it can pass further into the digestive tract. And also the beginnings of digestion itself. Mechanical breakdown, which can occur inside the mouth if chewing happens to be part of this animal's abilities. And also, of course, chemical breakdown, using things like maybe saliva. Now, the midgut is where most of the action is. This is the place where you get nutrient absorption. Okay, which is the most important part of digestion. The whole goal of digestion is to absorb these nutrients, right? That happens usually along a set of structures that can be called intestines, or in this case, it's this structure on our rove beetle, okay, called a ventricula, or the ventriculus. And it has all these little finger-like protrusions. These all increase surface area. Increases the ability to absorb more nutrients. Okay? Inside these intestines, or this midgut structure, you continue your chemical and enzymatic breakdown of food, making it smaller and smaller, releasing more and more nutrients, and absorbing them as you go. By the time food has passed to the end of the midgut, what is usually left over is all the stuff you couldn't digest. All the stuff you couldn't use. That waste passes into the hindgut and is eventually excreted. But the hindgut does something else as well. Yeah, it excretes waste, but it also reabsorbs water from your waste. Remember, water conservation is a major issue for animals. You want to save water everywhere you can. You don't want to excrete any more water than you have to because that's wasteful. Many of the organs in the hindgut are responsible for reclaiming as much water as possible from that waste before it's removed from the body. Now, the organs that you find in each of these regions of the alimentary canal can be really, really varied. and it highly depends on the diet of the animal. What you see on this slide are some of the most common structures found in the alimentary canals of animals. But keep in mind that not every animal is going to have every one of these structures. These are just the ones that we most commonly see. Most animals have some sort of mouth to allow food to pass into the body. And usually they have some sort of pharynx as well. And we'll talk about the pharynx more in a little while, but that's where food is held temporarily before it can be dumped into the esophagus. The esophagus is a long tube that moves food down towards the stomach. Sometimes, located along the esophagus, there will be a pouch called a crop. It's used for just temporary storage of food. Sometimes, on your way to the stomach, there will be another organ called a gizzard. Gizzards are used for mechanical digestion. They grind up food. Stomachs are used for preliminary chemical digestion. Okay, so they start to douse the food in things like acids and sometimes enzymes, and it helps the food to break down at the molecular level. Once the food has started to be rendered into small enough pieces, it will be released from the stomach into the intestines, which is where the majority of digestion and absorption of nutrients occurs. Anything left over will then be passed to some sort of excretory organ. There's 3 variants on this. You can have a cloaca, which is a multi-purpose opening. The cloaca can be used for liquid excretion, solid excretion, and also reproduction. It's a single hole that's used for all 3. Now, some animals have multiple openings for each of these different tasks. Animals that don't have a cloaca often have a rectum and an anus. The rectum is for storage, temporary storage, of waste, and the anus is for the actual egress or exit of waste. Now, these are all structures that are part of the alimentary canal itself. Here's what I mean by that. Let's say we have some theoretical animal, some made-up animal. You guys are well familiar with my stunning artistic skills now. There we go. Let's call that good. Here, I'll draw a couple little legs. Weird looking little legs. There we go. Good enough. Oops. All right. Lucky this isn't an art class. All right, here's what I mean when I say that the digestive tract is one long tube made up of all those individual organs. Okay, well, it starts with the mouth, and the mouth leads into an open chamber that holds on to food until you're ready to swallow it. That's called the pharynx. Okay. Now I'm going to draw an animal that has almost all the structures we just saw. Okay. Now notice that pharynx is going to get narrower until it turns into a skinny tube, and that skinny tube is called the esophagus. Now the esophagus can lead to one of a number of different structures. It might lead to a pouch. just a spot where that tube gets wider that's used for temporary storage of food. That would be a crop. Then it might lead to a really thick chamber. It's thick because its walls are really muscular. Maybe that's used for crushing food. If so, that would be a gizzard. And then maybe the tube is going to widen again into another large opening. It's used for chemical digestion. If so, that would be a stomach. And after that, maybe it leads to a long, skinny tube that loops around a lot. If so, that tube's probably going to be used for absorption of nutrients. Those are going to be your intestines. And then maybe this tube leads to another final chamber, which is where waste is held until you're ready to excrete it. That would be a rectum. And then finally, you have the exit from the tube that waste is expelled from. That would be the anus. Now notice, this is just one long, continuous tube. When food enters the body, it enters through the mouth, passes through the pharynx, and then without having to leave the tube, it goes down to the esophagus, into the crop, through the gizzard, through the stomach. We're still inside that same tube. Now the tube's long and skinny. It's the intestines we're moving through. Then the tube empties into the rectum and then finally out through the anus. Notice that each of these individual organs really are just part of a larger whole. This is one long continuous structure. Now that's important because there are going to be other structures that help with digestion, but they're not actually part of the tube. We're going to give those their own color and their own name. These are actually all listed on the next slide. They're called associated structures. We say they're associated because they're connected with the tube, but they're not part of it. They're on the outside. So that's what green means. A couple examples. There are glands here in the mouth called salivary glands that are going to produce your saliva, help with chemical digestion. There's another structure called the pancreas. Again, it's not part of the tube, but it helps. It secretes digestive enzymes into the intestines. You can also have a gallbladder. Gallbladders release something called bile. Bile helps with the breakdown of fat. You can also have a large structure, usually associated with the gallbladder, called the liver. The liver is what's going to produce bile in the first place. The gallbladder is then going to take that bile and concentrate it, make it really potent, and then inject it into the intestines. And then finally, some animals have a structure called a cecum. The cecum's really, really interesting. It houses bacteria, and these bacteria are very, very good at breaking down cellulose. Cellulose is what plant cell walls are made of. So if you look at a plant cell, it'll look like this, thinner line on the inside, and then all your organelles in here. This outer layer, that's your cell wall. That cellulose cell wall is incredibly hard for animals to digest. In fact, most animals cannot break down cellulose chemically on their own. They can mechanically crush these cells to pop them open, but they can't chemically digest the cellulose cell wall to release the nutrients that are inside the cell. However, many bacteria can. So bacteria help our digestion, and specifically of this cellulose. You need a place for those bacteria to reproduce and also to be housed. The cecum is what does that for many, many animals. Okay. Here's all those structures that we just discussed. The salivary glands, pancreas, gallbladder, liver, and cecum. Remember, these are all structures that are associated with that digestive tube, but they're separate from it. So where in your alimentary canal are you going to find all these organs? Well, for animals that have some of these organs, for animals that have, say, a mouth, a pharynx, and an esophagus, these three structures will all be found in the foregut of the animal. Which makes sense. That's where ingestion is going to occur. The mouth is going to capture food and help with that start that mechanical and chemical breakdown. The pharynx is the receiving region after the mouth that helps deliver food to the esophagus. And the esophagus is that tube that connects to the stomach. One important thing to know about it is that it moves food via a process called peristalsis. Peristalsis is a series of muscular contractions that pushes food down the esophagus. So when you eat a big, what we call a bolus of food, or a big chunk of food, and you swallow it, the walls of your esophagus are actually going to pinch inwards just behind that bolus and push it downwards. So that pinching action will continue squeezing that food down just like you would squeeze toothpaste out of a tube. The walls contract, forcing this bolus of food lower and lower. Just imagine how you get toothpaste out of a tube. That's the best way to picture this. You get a few other foregut structures as well. The crop is present in many animals, but not all. It's always anterior to the stomach, and it stores food until that food can be delivered to other organs later in the digestive tract. Some animals have a stomach. I know it sounds weird to say that some do, but not all do. If a stomach is present, it begins that chemical breakdown of food. And also some animals have a gizzard, but not all. Those that do use it for mechanical breakdown of food. The gizzard is very muscular, and it squeezes the food together along with grit or stones, or what are called horny plates. Grit is just sort of pulverized rock. Stones are stones, think pebbles. These are things that the animal has to consume. So birds will go around and they'll actually eat small rocks. The goal is to accumulate those rocks inside the gizzard, so that when the gizzard is muscularly contracting, it's forcing the food to be crushed between those stones, which actually helps grind it up. Insects and mollusks have built-in, horny, thick plates in the gizzard that also work as a grinding surface and help crush and grind up food. Now there's another structure that can be present. It's called a proventriculus. But what the proventriculus does differs based on the animal who has it. Okay, so this can get confusing. In birds, the proventriculus acts as a glandular stomach, meaning it just coats food in digestive enzymes before immediately moving it on into the gizzard. The goal here is that these digestive enzymes will be better mixed with the food when it's being crushed in the gizzard. So food doesn't spend much time in the proventriculus. It's not like a true stomach where food resides in the stomach and is mixed with acid over a long period of time. There's no long period of residency for food in the proventriculus in birds. But in insects and other invertebrates, the proventriculus does something different. Instead, it's a muscular expansion of the esophagus that is used to mechanically break down food. So in insects, the proventriculus acts more like a gizzard. But in birds, the proventriculus acts more like a stomach. So make sure that's clear. This can be confusing. That's it for our foregut structures. So let's move on and talk about the midgut. The midgut is primarily made up of intestines. Okay? They can be short or long, depends on the species and the diet. That's what determines intestine length. We're going to talk about that more at the end of the lecture. In the intestines, you'll have enzymes that break down carbohydrates, proteins, fats, all the components of your food. And then those components, those nutrients, are absorbed. This is the major site of nutrient absorptions, where most of it happens in the digestive tract. Now, the intestines are long to maximize surface area, but they can also be lined with these little finger-like structures. They're tiny, microscopic. These little structures are called villi. Okay? So they line the inner surface of the intestines, and the purpose is to increase surface area. All of those protrusions increase the surface area, which increases the absorption the intestines can do. The midgut is also where a lot of our associated structures attach to the digestive tract. So things like the liver and the gallbladder and the cecum, if they're present, they're going to attach here. Which leaves us with the hindgut. This is where excretion occurs, and also, don't forget, water reabsorption. Some structures you might find here are things like the large intestine, also sometimes called a colon. You see this in vertebrates. The colon's responsible for most of our water reabsorption, and it also will trap any remaining nutrients that your intestines didn't grab. If there's a rectum, you're probably looking at a vertebrate or an insect. That's where waste is going to be stored and also compressed into smaller pieces to make excretion easier. If there's a cloaca, you're probably looking at an amphibian, a bird, or a reptile, but you could also be looking at a type of mammal called a monotreme. Monotremes are egg-laying mammals. Things like the platypus and the echidna. Those are in fact the only remaining lineages of monotreme. These egg-laying mammals also have a cloaca. It's an opening used for all excretion and reproduction. If you don't have a cloaca, if you've got a rectum, you've probably got an anus. That's the opening for solid waste excretion only. All right. The remainder of this lecture is going to focus on comparative digestion, or how the structure of your digestive system is influenced by your diet. There's a general rule of thumb when it comes to digestive system structure and dietary components. The lower an animal's consumption of protein, the longer their digestive tract. You can also think about this the opposite way. The higher the consumption of protein, the shorter the digestive tract. Now, why is that the case? Well, remember, if you're not a primarily protein, if your diet isn't primarily protein-based, meaning you're probably not a carnivore, then your diet must be made up of plant material. And all of those plant cells have their nutrients trapped inside of that cellulose cell wall. You're going to need time to break through that cellulose wall in order to get at the nutrients inside, which means you need a longer tract to hold on to that food for longer. So take a look at these 4 examples. Down here we have a rabbit. Rabbits' diets consist almost exclusively of plant material. Deer, same thing. These guys are both called herbivores. Okay, they consume primarily plant material. Down here, we have a vole. Voles are carnivores. But they're a special type of carnivore called an insectivore. So you can probably guess that means they eat insects, which are very high in protein. Over here, you've got a fox. Fox is also a carnivore. Okay. But foxes will occasionally eat things like berries if they have to, if food is scarce. So they can eat some plant material. Okay. That's not true for our vole, and it's also not true for our deer. Our deer is what's called an obligate herbivore. Means they have to eat plant material. They have no dietary flexibility. That's what obligate means. So compare these relative digestive tracts. Our rabbit has a long, small intestine and a huge cecum. That indicates they're digesting a lot of cellulose. That cecum needs to be big to house a ton of cellulose-digesting bacteria. But notice their stomach is small and simple. Now compare that to our deer. Our deer has also that long intestine, but it's even longer than it was in the rabbit. See this spiral loop? That's a loop of intestine that's just been wound in on itself. There's a huge amount of intestinal surface area in that loop. They've got a big old cecum as well. And look at the size and complexity of their stomach. That complexity exists to help them digest cellulose. All of this indicates that these deer are reliant on nutrients trapped in cellulose and nothing else. Our rabbit might have a little bit more flexibility in what it eats, but not much. Now look at our vole. Our vole has a small, simple stomach and a relatively short intestine and a very simple digestive tract. And there's no cecum whatsoever. That tells you this vole is not eating plant material. Okay? Protein breaks down very, very easily when exposed to certain chemicals, and it makes it very easy to absorb nutrients. Okay? So you don't need much intestinal length in order to get all the nutrients necessary out of your food if you're a carnivore. Now look at the fox. Same thing, simple stomach, short intestines, but look at this. There's a cecum there. That suggests this fox mostly eats meat because of how short the tract is, but the presence of the cecum indicates that it may occasionally consume plant material as well. So the patterns are pretty clear once you look at them. Short tracts mean you're looking at a predator, carnivore. Really long tracts mean you're looking at an herbivore. Let's focus in on herbivore digestion because it's more difficult based on what they're digesting, and thus it has to be more complicated. There are two types of herbivore digestive tracts, non-ruminant and ruminant. Ruminant digestive tracts are named after this really interesting, complicated stomach. Okay, so let's compare these. Non-ruminant herbivores are herbivores with what's called a monogastric stomach. Mono meaning one, gastric meaning stomach. These guys have a single chamber stomach, so it looks like that. This chamber isn't subdivided, it's just one big open space. That's a monogastric stomach. Also sometimes called a simple stomach. Now, most cellulose breakdown in these guys is going to happen thanks to action from the cecum. So there really isn't much digestion that happens in the stomach, maybe a little bit. The majority of the digestion, though, occurs in the intestines. Now, this makes digestion of sufficient nutrients really difficult. It's because the food doesn't really get digested until it's already in your intestines, which means you have less time to absorb nutrients from it before you excrete it. There's a very common solution to this that you see among herbivores. It's called coprophagy. Copro, think of that as meaning poop. Phagy means eating or to eat. They literally consume their own waste products. The reason is their waste has a ton of valuable nutrition left in it, and it's already mostly digested, so most of the work of digestion is done. If they consume it again, it's going to be even easier to get nutrients out of it than the first time. Non-ruminant herbivores include things like rabbits and their relatives, many rodents, horses, and even some deer. Now, ruminant digestion is more complicated. The ruminant stomach is a 4-chambered stomach. So this stomach looks more like this. It's not a great diagram. Let's just draw a simple one. Essentially, it's subdivided into 4 different chambers. Okay? And something different happens in each of these chambers. This helps to maximize digestion of plant materials. These stomachs are geared towards getting past that cellulose barrier. They still have a significant cecum, meaning it's still large. They want to leverage as many tools as they can to get the most out of their food as they can. And another tool that they'll use is what's called regurgitation. Regurgitation is when you bring food back up your esophagus to the mouth. Regurgitation is followed by cud chewing, which is more formally known as rumination. Rumination is when you re-chew food that you've already swallowed. So regurgitation brings that food back up to the mouth, you chew on it some more, and then you swallow it back down again. And then you just rinse and repeat. Keep that process going until the surface area has been maximized, meaning the food is as small as you can get it. This helps promote breakdown and nutrient release. We think ruminant stomachs evolved only once. We think it's a monophyletic group of animals. Things like cows, sheep, elk, many deer, wild cattle, buffalo, goats. These are all examples of ruminants. Let's take a closer look at this ruminant stomach. I mentioned it has 4 chambers. Those 4 are the rumen, which is the largest. It's this entire space here. Then there's the reticulum, which is much smaller. Then there's the omasum, which is here in the middle. And then the abomasum, which is here on the bottom. The rumen is so big because it's where the majority of bacteria are found. Now, this is unique. In our monogastric stomachs, there was no bacteria, just acids and some enzymes. In this ruminant stomach, bacteria do the majority of the digesting. They're doing most of the work. The rumen is filled with bacteria that are going to ferment vegetation, break it down via fermentation in order to liberate nutrients from it. Food can be moved back to the mouth via reverse peristalsis, that's regurgitation, for additional chewing, additional cud chewing, in order to increase surface area even more. So you can swallow food, have it mix in here with your bacteria, then bring it back up to the mouth, chew on it to make it even smaller, then you'll swallow it again, let it mix more, bring it back up, and chew it till it gets even smaller. And you do this over and over again until the food is small enough for it to move on to the next stage. The rumen is lined with papillae for absorption. These again are, like our villi, little finger-like structures that increase surface area. This is also unique. Absorption is happening in our stomach if we are ruminants. This is absorption of nutrients. Remember, in a monogastric stomach, there's no absorption of nutrients either. No bacteria, no absorption. In a ruminant stomach, both are happening. Now, the one downside here is that the process of fermentation the bacteria are using to break down that cellulose produces huge volumes of gas. Now, here's why that matters. These animals have to get rid of that gas, or they can quite literally die. Let me show you what I mean. Right, here's a cow. The stomach of this cow is this whole thing. Look at how much of the body cavity is taken up by this stomach. This stomach is absolutely massive. But also look where it's located. This animal's lungs are just anterior to the stomach. Okay, they're up here. If the rumen swells because of a buildup of gas, that swelling will put pressure on the lungs. So as the stomach expands, it starts to push in on the lungs. The lungs will be forced up into the chest cavity and squished into a smaller size. As this pressure increases, as the gas builds up in the stomach, and the lungs will be prevented from inflating. The lungs will be squished flat. This means the animal will literally suffocate. Okay? That's why belching, the release of this gas, is so critically important. If these animals cannot vent that gas, it'll build up until it puts pressure on the lungs and suffocates them. Bloating can lead to asphyxiation in ruminant animals. So what happens when your food is finished being rendered by those bacteria in the rumen? Well, then it gets sent to this next chamber, which is called the reticulum. It's smaller. It continues the fermentation of this now smaller pieces of food material. Also, it acts as a filter. It'll collect any small, dense, foreign material that shouldn't be passed on to the rest of the digestive tract. Once the food has been filtered, that food, plus the bacteria-laden liquid it's floating in, is forced into this chamber, the omasum. There we go. The omasum is a rigid, heavy cavity lined with hard folds of tissue. These little lines here in the background of the drawing inside the omasum, those are ridges of hard tissue. This is a grinding organ. It acts just like a gizzard. It's going to constrict and grind up that food and fluid even further, to even further increase surface area. Remember, we're trying to maximize the release of nutrients, maximize how many of those nutrients we can absorb. Okay? Now, once that grinding is finished, that food and bacteria get dumped into this bottom chamber called the abomasum. The abomasum you can think of as a true stomach. Okay? It works like a monogastric stomach. But with one critical difference, and this is absolutely critical to understand. Yeah, it secretes acid like a normal stomach. But even more importantly, it secretes the enzyme lysozyme. Here's why that matters. Lysozyme can destroy bacterial cell membranes and walls. It means it'll kill the bacteria that are mixed in with your food. Large amounts of bacteria produced in the rumen can't actually be allowed to leave the stomach. The reason is if those stomach bacteria enter the rest of the digestive system, they can actually cause infection. They're meant to be in the stomach and they have to be contained there. So all the food leaving the stomach has to be sterilized first, and that's what the lysozyme does. Right, here is, again, our nice little image of the ruminant digestive tract. Again, I want to highlight just how massive this stomach is. It is still followed by intestines and a rectum and an anus, but just look at how impressive the stomach structure is itself. The last topic on digestion I want to cover is the relationship between highly evolved mouth morphology and digestion. Now, the mouth serves a more important role than just bringing food into the digestive tract. It has specialized morphology that helps to promote the digestive process itself. The act of mastication, which is our formal term for chewing, helps to crush food to increase the surface area, which maximizes enzyme contact, meaning the more surface area there is, the more access enzymes and acids have to that food particle and the faster they can break it down. Now, what's interesting is the amount of mastication that occurs in an animal depends heavily on its diet. Carnivores perform almost no mastication at all. They only reduce the food particle down to a size small enough for them to swallow. So as long as they won't choke on it, the food particle is small enough. Herbivores, though, are different. They've got to chew continuously, about 40 to 50,000 times a day. It's about 1/3 of their daily effort goes into just chewing. That's how much they have to increase surface area in order to digest their food. And it's all because of that cellulose cell wall and how hard it is to break through. Now, the mouth also can help bring food into the body more efficiently by helping with what's called prehension. Prehension is when you use a body part to bring food to the mouth. Now, you can use limbs or other appendages for this, like we use our hands and our fingers, but animals that don't have that luxury have to use things like their lips and their tongue. So notice this giraffe. Its tongue is highly muscular. It has very fine scale control over how that tongue moves, and the tongue can be used to wrap around a branch to strip it of leaves and to bring those leaves into the mouth. Llamas have a bifurcated upper lip, so the lip is split into two halves, and each half can be used independently or moved independently to help collect food and bring it into the mouth. Okay? All of that is prehension. You can tell a lot about an animal's diet based on its mouth morphology alone and its prehension adaptations. So I'm going to use rhinos as my example for this. We're going to compare the white rhino, Ceratotherium simum, with the black rhino, Diceros bicornis. Now, let me tell you a little bit about these animals first. The white rhinoceros is also sometimes referred to as a square-lipped rhinoceros, and you can tell why when you just look at this image down here. The upper lip seems square. They're the most social of all rhino species. There's actually two white rhino subspecies, the southern white and the northern white. The southern white is under a lot of stress. 5 years ago, there were only about 20,000 individuals left. I believe that number has gone down. The northern white rhinoceros has only 2 individuals left alive in the world, and both are in zoos. They are what we call functionally extinct. Now, if you look at this rhino, they are obviously kind of grayish-brown in color, yet they're called white, and we're not sure why. We don't really know where that common name came from. There's a popular theory that because the Dutch were likely the first to discover these rhinos when they were exploring Africa, when they communicated the existence of these rhinos to the English heard the Dutch word, I think it's called weij, and weij doesn't mean white, it means wide. We think the Dutch were referring to how wide this upper lip is, not to the color of the animal, but we're not really sure. The black rhinoceros, on the other hand, is somewhat of a different story. They're called the, hook-lipped rhinoceros. It's because look at how narrow and pointed the upper lip is. Kind of like a hook or almost a beak. They're critically endangered. There are 3 subspecies, but all of them are either endangered or one actually has been declared extinct. I think it was in 2011 that it was declared extinct. Unlike white rhinos, black rhinos are pretty solitary. There's a strong bond between mothers and calves, but once the calves are adults, they tend to wander off on their own. Okay. Males and females will, of course, socialize during mating season, but that's really it. Otherwise, they tend to be very solitary. They're not very territorial either. They will intersect each other's territories, and it doesn't cause any kind of dispute. Right? Let's compare the diets of these 2 animals. White rhinos are savanna grazers, meaning they graze on grass on these wide open plains. That's why they actually have a wide upper lip. Okay, this upper lip helps to gather grass towards the mouth so that then it can be placed between the incisors and cropped, meaning cut. Okay, so lots and lots of grass can be gathered up by this wide upper lip. Now look at the black rhino. Black rhinos do not feed on the savanna. They feed in woodland forests, meaning short-treed forests. There's lots of bushes and shrubs in these forests, and those are the leaves that these animals eat. Instead of cropping grass from the ground, they need to be able to strip leaves off of branches. Their upper lip is pointed, and it's what we call prehensile, meaning it's very muscular and it can be moved in precise motions, such as if they're feeding off of a branch, they can literally wrap their upper lip around the branch. Let me redraw that. Okay, here's the branch. They can wrap their upper lip around the branch and then move it upwards to strip off any leaves that they want to eat. Those leaves are then caught by the upper lip and placed into the mouth. So this is a nice, clear comparison of how prehension adaptations, meaning the shape of these upper lips, are so strongly influenced and determined by diet. All right, that's it for this lecture. I'll see you in part 2 for excretion.